All financial support for this podcast comes from my patrons on patreon.com. If you'd like to join in with the patrons, please check out patreon.com/DarwinGross. That's DarwinGrosse. Now enjoy the podcast. Okay, today I get a chance to talk to somebody that came out of nowhere for me. I was kind of like sitting back one afternoon paging through Facebook, and all of a sudden I saw some entries about some of my favorite synths and a person talking about doing some development on sound design. And as time went by, it was more and more of my favorite synths. It got to be, it was like watching a parade of all my favorites. And this person was involved in working with both the companies and with the individual machines over an incredible period of time. Now, anyone who listens to this podcast knows I kind of love talking to people who got a chance to surf through all of the changes that happened in synthesis from like the 80s through the 2000s and beyond. If there's anybody that answers that call, it's today's guest. His name is Drew Schlesinger, and I am just going to jump into it and say hi. So, hey, Drew, how are you doing?
I am doing great. How are you, Darwin?
All right. I want to thank you for taking this chat. I will tell you, man, I was blown away when you started like listing the different things that you had worked on. And I was just like, I mean, it literally was like watching a parade of my favorites or walk past the Facebook screen.
That's great. It's interesting, the whole history of how it started and the number of projects and products that I got to work on. I finally put a list together and started looking at it, and I was like, wow, that's a lot of stuff.
Yeah, right. So for people who aren't aware, why don't you give us a quick tour of what that body of work is?
Boy, a quick tour. Okay, so it really started in '86, starting with the Casio CZ-101, actually.
Okay.
Did some cartridges, did some sound patches, sold them at Manny's. And then Casio asked me to show at a NAMM show in the summer. I guess it was '87 or '88. And from there, I just started attending NAMM shows and eventually got to meet the people who were responsible for sounds and sound design for products across pretty much any manufacturer that was doing either effects devices or synthesizers. And I just kept knocking on their doors and saying, hey, this is what I do. And I started getting a resume, and one thing led to another. And it was pretty much all the manufacturers: Roland, Korg, Ensoniq, Kurzweil, Yamaha. It's hard to remember. Kawai, Technics, and then effects: Eventide, Lexicon, Sony, Yamaha. And, just one thing led to another. I started getting some very good response. And it was really just promoting myself and trying to get involved and build trust with these companies. And they would tell me about things that were upcoming. And EMU was another big one. Uh-huh. So between '86 and 2000, that was how I was making my living, doing sound design.
Yeah, it's really remarkable because there is sort of like this whole end of the music business that kind of doesn't exist anymore. I mean, you talk about like selling cartridges for the CZ-101, and I remember, that was my interaction with Manny's, was buying carts for the Casio or buying ESQ1 carts and stuff like that. They were one of the stores that actually was pretty big into supporting sound designers. I remember them particularly having interactions. I think they actually spun that off into like a side business or something.
There was a guy who at Manny's who was the main keyboard guy. His name was Rick Stevenson, who has recently passed away, who really ran a very tight ship there, but he really knew what was going on. And he was very supportive of sound designers. And I think it really started with the DX7 really changed everything when there were carts and you could store something, right? There was a hardware medium. Originally, as I said, I started on paper. I started selling Manny's patches on paper.
Oh, wow.
And then these Easy CZ cartridges came out, which allowed 64 sounds. And Manny's picked them up. And then I actually, just how that business started, I went to the public library in New York City and went through all of the major city yellow pages looking for music stores, got the names, called them up, and would say, I've got these cartridges for Casio CZ, and I think if you're selling them, they sell well, selling them at Manny's. And eventually I had this mail order business where I was sending out COD packages around the country at UPS, going there with a satchel late at night.
Oh, so that's amazing. That's wild. Now, one of the things that really blew me away was not only the number of things that you had done, but the extent to which you were responsible for some really iconic sounds over the years. I mean, the one that just really, very seldom do we think of specific sounds and say, first of all, that completely defines a piece of gear. But secondly, I learned the person who did it. And the one that blew me away was when you mentioned that you were involved you were working with Eventide and came up with the black hole algorithm, which I swear they could repackage the space reverb. They could just basically call it the black hole. They could package in a thing with no knobs, no nothing. And I would be the happiest user they would find. I mean, it's where that thing sits all the time. And so I was really blown away to be able to say, oh wow, this is a person that was involved in the creation of that sound.
That one, there's really two, and both are for Eventide. That one, and previously to that, on the H3000 was Crystal Echoes, which turned into what we now know as Shimmer.
Right.
That was the first commercial version of that. I think Brian Eno had done something with an AMX unit on his recordings prior to that, but there wasn't really a product available.
Right.
But Black Hole came about when they were developing the DSP 4000, and they had an amazing team building that. Ken Bogdanowicz, who went on to found Sound Toys, and Dave Durr, who built the Distressor, Empirical Labs. So they had an incredible team, and they had this really convoluted computer program called a SIG editor. They still have it, and it's graphical now, but at the time, it was how you built algorithms. I learned the SIG editor and realized I was actually doing computer programming.
Sucker!
And said, do you realize that you're actually programming? And I said, well, I guess I am. And Black Hole was an algorithm I did at like 3 a.m. one night. And it was just taking a number of diffusers and setting them up in a certain configuration. So it really was Black Hole is actually an algorithm built from the modules that they had internally in the SIG editor. And it just sort of took on a life of its own. And yeah, I would say that that's probably the most well-known patch that I've done ever for any device.
Yeah, well, it's just so iconic, and it's amazing to be able to talk to someone about the development of that. We're going to talk more about some of these things because I have a ton of questions. But before we do, one of the things that I like doing in my podcast is talking to people about their background, how they grew up and became and entered the industry, but also my podcast talks to people that have both an art and a technology side to their lives. And man, really, sound design is probably the epitome of combining the two. Because what you're doing is you're taking the technology and finding a way to make it musical, to make it artful in a way that other artists are going to be able to build on top of, right? And so I find sound design to be a particularly interesting area. I'm curious, what is your background, both your musical and your technological or your technical background, that kind of put you in a good position to take this on as your work?
So got to go back to it really started in 75. I was going to school at Ithaca College. That was right when synthesizers were really just starting to, Moog was there, they were starting to come out a little bit larger. You know, you had the ARP 2600 and the ARP Odyssey. My first synthesizer was shown by a guy named Don Croker who knew Moog. He showed the micro mode in a class that I was taking. And I was like, I'm going to get one of those. I went home for Christmas. I said to my parents, I said, I want to buy a synthesizer. That's what I want. It's not that expensive. It wasn't cheap. And that was my freshman year of college. So I got that. I had played organ. I never took any really serious music lessons. So I'm pretty much a self-taught musician, starting on the organ. I had a Gibson organ like the one that Ray Manzarek used in the Doors,
right.
The 101. And over the next couple of years, I started buying gear, but probably the most seminal and important thing that I did was in the summer of '76, I went to the Boston School of Electronic Music for a summer session. There, that was led by Jim Mitchmerheisen, who wrote the ARP 2600 manual.
Right.
They had an incredible, it was actually an apartment, a large apartment in Boston. And I spent a summer there and really learned synthesis. I mean, the basics of analog synthesis from really some of the smartest people at the time. It was really a great place. That's really how I started getting deeply involved in synthesis. And then all my free money that I could make and had went towards buying gear. I then bought an Oberheim expander module and the 8-step sequencer. I had a 4-track. And while I was at college, I built out a pretty decent small recording studio that was electronic music focused. And that was really how it started. And from that point, I did the recording with David Torn in 1978. When he bought an ARP Avatar, I said, hey, I heard you bought this Avatar. I have this studio. Why don't you bring it over? I'll show you how to use it. We can explore it. And I had been doing some recording, and then we ended up recording something like 20 pieces together, which sat in obscurity for 40 years until last year. So that's how my background started.
Got it. Now, sound design like work now is a little bit different because, you know, it's sort of gotten normalized that artists will make their own sounds. That wasn't really the case when some of these early machines came out. You talked about particularly the DX7. You know, there's so many stories about like technicians getting a 5-year-old DX7 in for repairs and not a single preset had been changed, right?
That totally true. Same for the Prophet 5. That was
Prophet 5 as well, right?
Said, you know, most of the units that came back still had the factory sounds.
The factory sounds. But now so for you as a person who is making sounds, what did you do to sort of like inspire yourself to make things that you thought would be worth sharing? I mean, were you like in a band and you made sounds that worked in your band? Did you just love making sounds and hope that other people would like them? Did you get commissions from people? How did you get pulled into sound design, and how did you get inspired to make things for other people to use?
So that's a great question. And it really started with the CZ-101, which I bought and fell in love with. And of course, it had the cartridge expandability. And I just started making sounds. And I made sounds that, well, my tagline was the most unique and musically useful sounds for the Casio CZ. So I would listen to all the music that was happening, and I would imagine the different types of tones that somebody might want. And the Casio, some of the internal sounds were really cheesy.
Right.
So I was really trying to make a really wide selection of sounds that I could see people using in recording or playing in bands, analog sounds, some digital sounds. I tried to stay away from cheesy sounds. So some really warm sounds. So I really tried to design sounds that would provide sort of if you think about it as an orchestration, you know, I'm going to use these sounds together that would be sort of complementary but different. So I kept thinking about, how would you have an orchestra? What are the kind of tonalities you'd have in an orchestra from an electronic music perspective? I tried to make them all playable so that a keyboardist could play them and hopefully they would resonate and that they were inspirational. They would inspire them to make music. So I guess I was good at it because people responded and they really liked them. I got fan mail, which was really pretty funny because I was selling them. It really started, I started with a little ad in the back of Electronic Musician, and people would order them. I'd sell them COD and I'd ship them out, and I'd get letters saying, "These are great. When are you going to put out a next one?" And then I ended up making 3 64 voice cartridges, and they sold really well. I mean, I really was able to make a good portion of my living selling those cartridges COD and to stores. So,
and did you just like buy the memory carts retail and then just mark it up from there, or did you have any arrangement with Casio themselves?
No, it was nothing to do with Casio except that they were very supportive. I met Jerry Kowarski and Ed Ahlstrom from Casio through Manny's. But the carts, I found the manufacturer, I contacted them. I had boxes made, I printed up the inserts. So it was really like right out of my apartment on the Upper West Side of New York. I was buying the pieces, putting them together, programming each one by hand with a little portable Commodore 64 and a Passport MIDI interface, one of the first ones. And I forget which editor software, and I'd flip the switch, load a bank, flip the switch, load a bank.
Oh my goodness.
So it was pretty tedious. So when I started selling a lot of them, I was still a one-man band. So it was a lot of work, but it was very satisfying.
Sure. Yeah, I'll bet. Now, one of the interesting things is it was kind of the advent of digital synth systems that kind of opened a door for doing your kind of work too, because prior to that, I mean, there were presets and like you said, you could get some information out to people with patch sheets, but it was really those cartridges and then later on floppy disks that were embedded into machines that were really the transport mechanism that let you have kind of a robust business, right?
Yes, it was actually the ability to have a portable, as you said, transportable mechanism to deliver the sounds, plug the sounds in. Floppy disks obviously were great, but most of what I did were on the cartridges. Then I did some RAM cards for the Kawai K1, and at that point, pretty much all the synthesizers started to have that capability, the ability to plug in some sort of media, whether it was a card or a RAM card, and load additional sounds. And if you think about it, I mean, the Prophet 5 and the Oberheim 4-voice, well, the Prophet 5 had a cassette interface, which was notoriously finicky.
That was rough.
Yeah, and not something you could do easily, which is probably why most of the units came back with the factory sounds. So yes, you're absolutely right. Once there was a medium to deliver the sounds, that really opened the door. And there were a number of companies. There was a company called Valhalla, Fat Man Music, Sound Source Unlimited out in LA, which had Manny Fernandez, who had done a lot of Yamaha work. So it was really the start of third-party soundware. That was really where it started.
Yeah, and I remember actually there was like, for the ESQ1, I remember getting like sound crystals and stuff like that.
Yes,
there was a wide range of companies, and you would get Keyboard Magazine, and fully half the ads were sound companies. It was a real boom of a business. It's something else. Now, my question for you is, you kind of worked from that into actually working with the manufacturers themselves. So then when, with Roland synths and some of these others, you actually were involved in making the presets that shipped with the machine.
Yes, and that was the big transition. And actually, once I started doing that, I stopped selling my own sounds. So I had put out the Casio carts, I put the Kawai K1 carts out, and then I wrote a book called The Insider's Guide to the Casio CZ synthesizer for Alfred Publishing.
Oh, okay.
And between doing that and having my name on the book and going to the NAMM shows, the first job was really for the Korg M3R ethnic card. I had met Jack Hotop. Korg were out on Long Island. I was living in New Jersey, so they were local.
Oh, okay.
I went there. I met them. There's a guy named Kim Holland who was the head of marketing, I think, at the time, and Jack was the main sound guy and still one of the best sound designers there are on the planet.
Right.
And he said, well, let's give this guy a shot. And I worked on that. I did some sounds for that card and established a relationship with Korg. And then, as I said, then I started going to the NAMM shows and saying, this is what I've done. Send me a unit. Let me show you a couple of patches. And I really kind of established the baseline for how I would work, which is I would say, I'm going to charge you for X dollars for each patch, whether you choose to use them or not. That way, the manufacturer could choose how much of their budget they wanted to give to me.
Right.
And it was the same for every manufacturer. So I had a set price on a per patch basis. And I said, just let me know how many you want. And usually it was somewhere between 25, 50, or 100.
Interesting.
And that kept it even across the manufacturers. Wasn't always so great for me because it was the harder the machine to program, the longer it took to make the sounds. But it was a good business model. It was even, and everybody felt that they were getting a fair shake. I wasn't giving one a better deal than another.
Now, a lot of times the machines that you worked on, so if we look at like some of the Emu machines, some of the Roland machines, some of the Korg machines, you worked on machines that were, what we now call romplers. They had a bunch of samples in ROM and then programming to sort of like take advantage of those samples. Were you ever involved in choosing or creating the samples that were used, or did you generally get the machine after that was already locked and loaded?
I actually decided not to get involved in sampling, which is interesting. To this day, I've really never been much involved on the sampling side. There were people that were doing it better than I thought I could. I didn't have really access to a lot of the source material. Mm-hmm. So I would generally get the units once the ROM was burned. And again, my approach, which was I was sort of a certain flavor that they would hire. Expressive, unique sounds. I wasn't the guy that they came to when they wanted a realistic violin or the best piano.
Or the Hammond or whatever, yeah.
Right. I was not that guy. I was the guy that when they wanted something that was going to be different, unique, expressive, and those were the emotive sounds that, even if they were comping keyboard kind of sounds, but not using the raw sample on its own, really doing a lot of manipulation to create something different from the source sound. Even if it was a violin, I would change the attack and make it a drone with multiple layers, interweaving. So those were the kind of sounds that I was known for. And that was sort of my moniker after a while. That's what I got known for.
What systems did you work on for Emu? Because they had a real wide spread of stuff. Were you involved in any of the Proteus systems?
No, I actually got involved with them right after the Proteus.
Okay.
Morpheus was the first module that they came out with when they started making all those rack mount modules. Mm-hmm. And the Morpheus had a RAM card slot.
Oh, so that would be like the time of like the MoFat and Planet, whatever.
Those all came. Kind of things? So it was the Morpheus was first, then the Ultra Proteus, both of which had the Z-plane filters.
Right.
And these incredible function generators, which were straight out of the Buchla school of function generating devices that had conditional jump points and all sorts of things. Right. Really complex. And the Z-plane filters really allowed you to take the ROM and really manipulate it. They were great. And then they went on to the Orbit, the MoFat, the classic keys, the vintage keys, Carnival. They came out with a ton of ROM-based modules, all similar.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, though, because you talk about working on the Morpheus. I knew a number of people that became obsessed with that system, and particularly because of the Z-plane filter and those crazy envelopes. But a lot of times, It was sort of like what now I think of as doing with max patches, where people will make a thing where it lights up and then it just goes off and does a thing for a long period of time. You could make those kind of patches with that period's EMU system, right? How were you able to rein that in and make a musically useful sound out of something that I would think that it would be too tempting just to go off in left field. And next thing you know, you made a bunch of demo sounds, but not really anything that a player could use.
And that was a constraint. You had to consciously say, is this sound something that can be used within a musical context?
Mm-hmm.
And I always, again, thought from an orchestration standpoint, just general musical orchestration. How might somebody use this sound? Which didn't mean that I wouldn't create things that were strange. But again, from a marketing standpoint, they were looking for sounds that somebody was going to say, oh, I could see how I'm going to use that. So it was striking a balance between something that was interesting, unique, but again, musically useful, that you could hear a tonality. Generally wouldn't go into non-tonal sounds that went on forever. So you had to limit your choices. Now on the side, while I'm home doing it for myself, whole different story. Then I'm trying to make it sound as way out as I possibly could. I was trying to make it sound like a Buchla 200, But for the work that I did, it was like, okay, I'm doing a job. I was hired to do a job, and I was aware that they're interested in selling units. When somebody scrolled that dial, they wanted to be able to hit a note, play a sound, hit a note, play a sound, and get some idea of what's being provided there for them that's going to give them something different and new. And the Morpheus was great at that, as was the Ultra Proteus. The Z-plane filters, even to this day, they're still two iconic devices that are still probably not that well known in general. To synthesists, yes. To the average person, not so much.
So of all of the different devices you got to work with, let's talk about the synthesizer side first. On all the different synths that you got to work with, what was your favorite and what was the most difficult to achieve good results on?
I would say it's really hard to pick a favorite, but two in particular stand out for a number of reasons, which are the Korg Prophecy and Korg Z1, for a number of reasons. That the physical modeling approach that they had done really provided for incredible expressiveness and really different sounds, both analog. They were doing analog, they were doing mallet sounds, they were doing blown pipe sounds. You could try to make a trumpet sound that would actually break as you pitched up, the way a trumpet will crackle if you don't play well. And those two synths, I got to go to Japan with Korg to do final voicing. So those two hold a special place for me. They were brilliant machines, and I got in really early before there was even a prototype. That was on a computer prototype.
I was gonna actually ask you that, because the one thing I remember about both those devices is that their controller systems were actually pretty unique. Like the Prophecy had that like weird roller log with a slider surface and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
And it seemed to me like a lot of the voices really were almost like finely tuned to work with the kind of manipulation you could get out of that.
Absolutely. Actually, that was part and parcel of what made those instruments unique. Not only the synthesis methods, but the controls that they provided at the time, which were pretty forward thinking. The log was a pretty funny one because we had all the names for it on a whiteboard at Korg, and they couldn't read them. Some of the names shall not be mentioned. They're politically correct, but we had a whole lot of fun with those. But between the two wheels, the log, the ribbon controller embedded in the log, aftertouch, velocity, it was a ton of work to really make a sound, because to a certain degree, you almost had to employ those various devices because you didn't want it to sound like an organ. The idea with
Yeah.
that instrument was to try to make it expressive and alive,
Mm-hmm.
because it wasn't a ROM, right? It's really synthesis from the ground up with
Right.
lots of ability to manipulate all aspects of the sound, even the analog stuff. So yeah, they were very forward looking in terms of their control mechanisms and what they allowed you to do. And we were really supposed to look to utilize those and leverage those controls to really make expressive sounds. You said what was the hardest one? Gee, I'm thinking back. Funny enough, maybe the first Alesis quadrasynth. And the only reason I say that, it was a very powerful synth, but it had a one pole filter.
Oh,
So
no.
it had I think it was a 6 dB cutoff, no resonance. So you really had to do things with envelope shaping and various other techniques to make it sound different. It would sound great for acoustic sounds, but to get the kind of sounds that I'm used to doing, there wasn't a lot from a filtering perspective, to manipulate the
weren't
sound.
a lot of tools at hand, right?
No, it was straight sounds. So you really had to layer things and cross fade and velocity fade. Very powerful chip that they had created at the time. A great sounding synth, but I would say that was a challenging device to work on and get different, unique sounds.
Sure. Now, the other thing is, and I know this from my work in the music industry too, you never know ahead of time what's going to be a hit and what's going to be a stinker, really. Sometimes you can get a sense of it when you're playing with it, but a lot of times you don't know until the market decides, right? I imagine that you worked on a lot of synths that, or effects devices that just ended up not going anywhere, or maybe just not getting their place in history that maybe they deserved. What are some of those that you can think of?
Actually, the ones that I think are most overlooked and underrated and not well known from a effects device was Sony. They came out with 4 devices. I don't remember what year it was, but there was a reverb, a delay, a modulation, and a filter. And they were single rack space devices, beautifully designed, incredibly powerful, sounded awesome. But Sony's marketing was not sexy. You know, Sony had a very sort of staid kind of approach to their marketing. And I don't think that those devices ever really took off the way they should have, because they were great. There's an old story, which I mentioned on one of my Facebook posts, that apparently Lou Reed, somebody dragged a EMT plate up to his studio and he had the Sony R7, and he said, "No, I think I like what's in the Sony box better," which I'm sure was not music to the guy who had the EMT plate.
Carry the plate, right?
But so those are probably the hidden gems.
I've heard stories, particularly about that R7, and there's like some chip in that fails, and people who are adherents to that thing, just search them out wherever they can find them, because they are so beloved by some people.
Well, it was a stereo reverb, and actually they created the first stereo reverb. I think it was the 201. The R201 or something like that, which Ibanez had actually packaged. And that's probably around 86, 87. And that was the first true stereo algorithmic reverb. So Sony had actually been doing it for quite a while.
Uh-huh.
And I have heard subsequent that some of the chips inside had issues over time. Now we're talking things that were from 1990s, early 90s. So 30 years ago.
30 years, right.
And now as I'm starting to post some of these things on Facebook, I'm seeing that some of these devices had things that failed, but at the time, the failure rates were very low.
Who knew, right?
They worked. Batteries, of course, would go bad,
but when you're working on this stuff, whoever thinks about how it's going to work 30 years from now, either,
who even thought 30 years, we were thinking, what's coming out next NAMM show? What's going to be in the summer NAMM? And of course, at that point, there's no internet. What's showing up you go to the NAMM show, and that's where you find out what's new. And then Keyboard Magazine, Electronic Musician, those were probably the two main vehicles for getting those, the word out on new products.
Right.
A lot of people trying to get this, space in the magazines for reviews, etc. So those are probably the unsung devices. I'm trying to think if from the synth world, actually the one from the synth world that probably is also similar is the Technics WSA-1.
I was going to specifically ask about that. I knew that you had worked on that, and I actually had a friend who was a big fan of that synth, but he was like the only person I ever knew who ever even had one.
I think Technics suffered from Techniques-itis. Nobody thought Technics synthesizers. I mean, they were. Why would
I buy a synth from a company that I normally would buy a cassette deck from, right?
Right, or a turntable. Yeah. But they really hit it out of the park in a lot of ways. I mean, it was similar to the Korg devices, 3 wheels, huge display, an orb controller, which was like a ball, physical modeled filters, lots of voices. That was also a difficult one to work with because you were taking static ROM sounds and you were creating the animation through the physical modeled filters. Had some great effects. And when I posted it, I was surprised that people were like, yeah, I have one of those. I love it. Or that's the one that I'm trying to find.
Right.
It was totally unique. And it was also it was a hybrid between a Morpheus and sort of the Korg Prophecy. It sort of fell in between because it was ROM-based, but it had physical modeling with lots of control. And I think it was a commercial flop. They didn't sell many. And unfortunately, they stopped and they never took the next step.
Right.
That's how large corporations is not uncommon.
Right. Yeah, well, they never touched synthesis again, ever.
No,
so
they were gone.
Right. So when we started this talk, you talked about kind of doing it from like the late 80s through 2000. Do you still do sound design work?
Very little. So the true story is in 1998, I joined the corporate world doing web program management in the financial services industry. And how that came about was, which I haven't posted yet, I created a product called EarSaver, which was a downloadable ambient music player. This predates iTunes by a few years, 97 and 98. It used a tracker engine, and I made these little samples that I would crossfade so that I could play hours worth of ambient music. It was soundscapes. I did that, put that out. It was licensed to Simon & Schuster. They put it in a box. They sold it in CompUSA. And then I had a neighbor next door who was working at Merrill Lynch. He said, I need somebody to do what you just did with that and help me. And over a period of 2 or 3 years, I transitioned out of the sound design. I think the last product that I worked on was the V-Synth for Roland.
Okay.
And I pretty much have been quiet in the background for the last 20 years. I did some work for a few software companies. Sound Toys is Ken Bogdanowicz, who started Sound Toys, was a main engineer at Eventide. So I've done a lot of work with them over the years for all of their plugs and the rack. I did some work with GeForce on a couple of their synths.
Oh, that makes sense, sure.
So I haven't really done much in a very long time. I haven't been dormant over the last few years. I started using Live and actually Max for Live and really starting to learn that. So it was hard. It's like cutting the cord and just going from one world to the next. Going from the musical industry to the corporate world was really very strange. I called my wife up. I said, I've landed on an alien planet and I don't understand what they're talking about.
Well, believe me, in the financial world, everybody there said, oh my goodness, an alien just walked in the door.
Yes. And I still had long hair. But And really what predicated that was actually fear. When I saw what was going on with the VSTs, when Cubase came out,
right,
I started to see a noticeable decrease in hardware, the amount of hardware that was being built. And there's an old saying, look afar and see the end from the beginning. And I was like, I think this is going to have a real impact on hardware manufacturing. And it did. I mean, there was not 2003 up until, I don't know, 2010, 11, things were pretty quiet. I mean, Korg and Roland kept churning out things, but of course, in the last few years, things have just exploded. So I figured, I did all this work. Nobody knows about it. I felt like I was kind of like the Chuck Yeager of the sound design industry. I never went to the moon, but
you needed your own version of the right stuff, right?
Right. So got a piece of chewing gum. Don't worry, I'll be back. And actually, I think about that movie. I think it was Apollo 13. I think it was Sam Shepard who played Chuck Yeager. But I decided, I might as well put this out there. Just, if nothing else, just to let people know that, I did this work and see what happens. And also to find the other people that I knew had collaborated. I was only one of many people who contributed to these instruments. So through these posts, it really has exposed all these other people who have done work on the same devices from different parts of the world, Germany, Japan, UK. And there's there's really some stellar sound designers out there. I was one of many who are really talented. Jack Hotop, Eric Persing, probably, the pinnacle. Skippy from Plugin Guru. Jordan Rudess was doing sound design as well.
Right.
So there was a relatively small cadre of people doing it, but larger than I thought. And it's been interesting to see and get noticed or notices back from people saying, "Hey, I did sounds on that too." So it's been fun.
Yeah, well, I want to so much thank you for not only sharing this story, but sharing the story of your work. And, again, like every day it would be like, boom, there's an Ensoniq unit. Boom, there's the JD 990. It was literally such a parade of like memories for me, and clearly memories for you too. And I want to thank you so much for sharing that.
It's a pleasure. I really appreciate you reaching out. It's been fun. I've enjoyed talking with you, and still a few more things to come. But I think the history is now written, and we'll see what the next chapter is. Maybe it'll lead to some new work in the future. I kind of hope so.
I hope so too. Well, with that, I'm going to let you go. Thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure. Nice speaking with you. Have a great day.
Yep.
Bye.
Many thanks to Drew for having the great chat about all of that stuff. I mean, it really is amazing to hear about his experiences working with all these great manufacturers, doing all these great synths. Again, if you get a chance, jump over to Facebook and follow Drew. His reminiscences about the work on all of these various synths is really pretty fantastic. I want to thank you, the listeners, for continuing on, keeping on, and for getting your friends and others to listen. Do spread the word. It is really fabulous. And if you want to help support the podcast, please head over to patreon.com/DarwinGross and chip in a little bit. If nothing else, you'll get a chance to watch me bloviate in words as well as listening to me bloviate in audio. So in any case, thank you so much for listening, and we will catch you next time around.